Choir. I have a very intellectual and spiritual friend who became a pastor rather unexpectedly. A few years ago, I heard the news that he had become a head pastor of a church. Not too long after that, I had a chance to meet him. However, I could not recognize him, for he had gained so much weight. His new congregation had fed their beloved new pastor so much. Well, you can probably guess the point I'm trying to make in this sermon. It is on how to welcome Jesus, or true hospitality for Jesus. Here in our passage, Martha and Mary demonstrate the importance of both our serving and worship of the Lord. Their attitude and approach towards Jesus are two fine illustrations of us Christians. However, immediately preceding this story, we hear Jesus tell a parable of the Good Samaritan about the importance of loving a neighbor and receiving love from an unlikely Samaritan neighbor. Here, we have the importance of loving God, listening to God. Put together, they take us back to what the expert of the law said just before Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan, which was, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. In the Good Samaritan story, the priest and the Levite were so focused on loving God that they overlooked their neighbor. Now here, Martha is so concerned about loving Jesus as guest or neighbor by being busy that she overlooked loving God. However, Mary's focus on loving God and Martha's focus on loving neighbor go together. One is not more important than the other. Now let's go to the theme of Martha's open home in verse 38. Hospitality was exceedingly important in the biblical world in general, and in Luke's gospel in particular. Martha received Jesus into her house. She lives in the town of Bethany with Mary, her sister, and Lazarus, her brother, who did not seem too poor. We do not know how many servants they might have had, but Martha was very hospitable. Her home was always open to Jesus and his disciples. Custom in Martha's time served a meal for a guest, which is diakonion in Greek. So she set herself about the task of preparing food for Jesus. So Martha, in fact, would seem, from a customary standpoint, to be doing the good thing. Cooking and cleaning the house, and etc. But notice how Jesus was not looking for someone to feed him physically, but for someone whom he could feed spiritually so that one would mature in his word. Now the next theme is Mary's open heart in verse 38:9. Mary sits at Jesus' feet, listening to his words. Rather than assuming the role expected of women in her culture, she takes her place at the feet of Jesus. She assumes the posture of a student learning at the feet of a rabbi, a role traditionally reserved for men. Culturally, the problem presented by this is not the portrait of a woman serving, for this was expected, but of a woman assuming, and not only assuming, but even preferring the role of a disciple. This speaks of her true discipleship, wanting to learn from Jesus. And Jesus commends her, protecting her from accuse of other people around her. Indeed, at the feet of the Master was the proper place for a disciple to be. The Bible records that Mary was at the feet of Jesus 3 times, at least 3 times. First, here, where she sat at Jesus' feet, and second, in the Gospel of John, where she falls at Jesus' feet, and third, in John 12, verses 1 to 3, where she anoints Jesus' feet with nard for his burial. Now, the next theme is Martha's many things. This pleasant story takes a sharp turn when Martha, distracted by her many tasks in the kitchen and elsewhere in the house, comes to Jesus and asks, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the work by myself? Tell her then to help me." Many would empathize with Martha's resentment of her sister for leaving her to do all the work. Jesus' response to Martha seems less than empathetic, chiding her for her distraction and worry. "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There is need of only one thing." The problem with Martha is not that she's busy serving and providing hospitality. Certainly, Jesus commends this kind of service to the neighbor many times, notably in the parable of the Good Samaritan immediately before this story, as I mentioned. The problem with Martha is not her serving, but rather her attitude that she's worried and distracted. The word translated distracted in verse 40, the Greek word is periespato, has the connotation of being pulled or dragged in different directions. Another word, the word hospitality, refers to the relationship between a guest and a host, wherein the host receives the guest with goodwill, including the reception, entertainment of guests, visitors, or even strangers. By metonymy, the Latin word hospital means a guest chamber, guest lodging, an inn. Hospes is thus the root for the English words host, hospitality, hospice, hostel, and hotel. Louis Chevalier de Jacquot describes hospitality in the encyclopedia as the virtue of a great soul that cares for the whole universe through the ties of humanity. And hospitality ethics is a discipline that studies this usage of hospitality. In fact, Martha breaks all the rules of hospitality by trying to embarrass her sister in front of the guest, and by asking her guest to intervene in a sibling dispute. She even goes so far as to accuse Jesus of not caring about her. There is no greater hospitality than listening to your guest. How much more so when the guest is Jesus? Jesus' words to Martha may be seen as an invitation rather than a rebuke. Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things. There's need of only one thing. And Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken away from her. Jesus was in her home, but Martha had lost focus. Martha's service was not inferior at all, but after a while, her impatience and business to make an impression or even show off her hospitality caused her to forget why she was doing the work in the first place. She no longer carried out her duties out of love for the Lord, but with a negative attitude. Jesus pointed out Martha's mistake by telling her how much she was distracted and anxious about many things. Now, the last theme of Mary's one thing in verse 42. Mary's priority was listening and learning from Jesus. She was not distracted by many things. This is the one thing better that Mary chose. Observe that Jesus did not say that Mary did a better thing by not working, but by listening to Jesus. He did not condemn Martha's service at all. Notice that to dwell in the Lord's presence means that there is a time to serve and a time to be still and silent before the Lord, according to Zephaniah chapter 1, verse 7. Jesus here definitely is not giving more value to a contemplative life over an active one. However, in a culture of hectic schedules and the relentless pursuit of productivity, we are tempted to measure our worth by how busy we are and how much we accomplish, or by how well we meet the expectations of others. Preaching on this text may provide rich opportunity to address this cultural discomfort, which is even to an extent of illness at times, culturally. Many people in our congregation likely identify with Martha, feeling pulled in different directions, feeling worried and distracted by many things. These seem to be common threads of life in our fast-paced world. And yet, as Jesus says in Luke 12:25, can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? We know that worrying does no good, and that much of what we worry about is not so important in the larger scheme of things. And yet, we cannot seem to quell our anxious thoughts and frantic activity. It is true that much of our business and distraction stems from the noblest of intentions. We want to provide for our families. We want to give our children every opportunity to enrich their lives. We want to serve our neighbors. And yes, we want to serve the Lord. Indeed, where would the church be without its Marthas, those faithful folks who perform the tasks of hospitality and service so vital to making the church a welcoming and well-functioning community? And yet, if all our activities leave us with no time to be still in the Lord's presence and hear God's word, we are likely to end up distracted and anxious. We are likely to end up with a kind of service that is devoid of love and joy and is resentful of others, like Martha's attitude. Both listening and doing, receiving God's word and serving others are vital to the Christian life. Just as inhaling and exhaling are to breathing. Yet how often do we forget to breathe in deeply? Trying to serve without being nourished by God's word is like expecting good fruit to grow from a tree that has been uprooted. Choosing the good part means being in the right place while listening to the right voice and setting the right priorities while being careful for distractions. Mary's priority was to listen to Christ as God. Martha's priority was to serve Christ more as a guest. Luke's story is left suspended. We do not know what happened next, whether Mary and Martha were reconciled, whether they were all able to enjoy the meal that Martha had prepared, whether Martha was finally able to sit and give her full attention to Jesus. We do know that Jesus invites all of us, even young women like Mary and Martha among the Jewish men, to sit and rest in his presence, to hear his words of grace and truth, to know that we are loved and valued as daughters and sons of God, to be renewed in faith and strengthened for service. Martha's distraction and worry leave no room for the most important aspect of hospitality, which is gracious attention to the guest. There is no greater hospitality than pleasing your guest. Back to my story of a pastor friend who is a very good pastor. As a spiritual leader, what do you think he really wanted from his new congregation? I want to close with this word. The good can be the enemy of the best at times. Amen.